A rich man opens his door to a quiet stranger, but within minutes his entire past, every secret he buried 18 years ago, starts to fall apart. And the person in front of him, he's not just here to talk, he's here to change everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The knock on the door came just as the sun began to set behind the tall white walls of the mansion. It echoed through the marble hallway, sharp and unexpected, breaking the quiet that usually settled around the house at this time. The butler paused for a second, surprised. No one came without an appointment, and certainly not unannounced. Still, he walked to the heavy front doors and opened them slowly. A young man sat in a wheelchair, dressed neatly, his face calm but unreadable. His eyes held something different, something the butler couldn't place. "I need to see the owner of the house," the young man said politely. His voice was steady, not nervous, not demanding, just certain. The butler hesitated, unsure. The boy didn't look familiar, but something about the way he spoke made it difficult to say no. After a pause, he nodded and asked the man to wait in the sitting room while he informed the master. Upstairs, the man who owned the house sat in his private study, a glass of expensive wine resting beside him, reports spread out before him. His life had become quiet in recent years, but that's how he liked it. Controlled, clean, untouched by past mistakes. He had built everything from the ground up. The business, the house, the respect in the community. Everything was his, and he made sure nothing from his old life could stain it. The butler stepped in and spoke softly. "There's a visitor, sir. A young man. He says he wants to speak with you." The man frowned. "Who is he?" "He didn't say, sir, but he looks serious." There was a pause. Then he sighed, put down the report, and said, "Fine. Send him in." Back in the sitting room, the young man waited silently. His fingers rested gently on the armrest of his chair. He looked around the room, high ceilings, expensive paintings, crystal lights. But nothing impressed him. Nothing made him pause. Not anymore. When the man entered, he walked with the same confidence he always had, shoulders straight, eyes sharp. He looked at the visitor, and for a second, his face didn't change. Just another person in his day. Then his eyes landed on the wheelchair, and then on the face. He stopped walking. The room fell silent. "Do I know you?" he asked, confused but firm. The young man looked at him carefully. "No," he said, "but you should." The words hung heavy in the air. The man's forehead creased. He hated games. He didn't like being made to guess. "You have 5 minutes," he said coldly. "Say what you came to say." The young man gave a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It took me 18 years to come here. I think I'll need a bit more than 5 minutes." The man narrowed his eyes, his voice sharper now. "Who are you?" The answer came like a slow knife. "I'm the child you left behind," he said. "The one you called a mistake. The one you said was better off dead." The man's breath caught. His chest tightened. His hands curled into fists. And for the first time in many years, fear began to creep into his eyes. He took a step back, his face pale. The calm air around him cracked just for a moment. "What are you talking about?" he said, though his voice had already lost its strength. The words came out slower now, less sure, like he was trying to find ground that was no longer there. The young man didn't move. He kept his eyes on him. "You remember the hospital, the cold room, the doctor who told you your son wouldn't walk, wouldn't talk like other children? You remember how you looked at him, like a curse? You remember the choice you made?" The man's jaw tightened. "That's not possible. That, that baby died." "No," the young man said, his voice even. "He lived. You just chose not to look back." The man turned away for a second, walking toward the window, trying to hide the shake in his hand. Outside, the garden stretched wide and perfect. Trimmed hedges, glowing lights, everything he had built. He stared at it, as if it could protect him. "You can't just show up here and—" "I didn't come here to beg," the boy interrupted, "or to destroy anything. I came because you deserve to know what you left behind. You don't get to rewrite it." There was silence again. "You have no proof," the man said. though his voice had dropped. It was more fear now than anger. People like to say things. I've dealt with this before. I don't need to prove anything to you, the boy replied. But your past is about to speak louder than your name. The man turned around sharply. Is this blackmail? Is that what you want? The boy's eyes hardened. I want nothing from you. I've lived my whole life without your help, without your name, without your money. I came here to give you one thing, truth. What you do with it is up to you. The man walked slowly toward him now, his face changing. Less controlled, more confused, more exposed. If what you're saying is true, why now? After all these years, the young man leaned back slightly. Because today, you're giving a speech at a foundation for disabled children. Cameras, media, board members. You'll say words about hope and care. But I know the man behind the suit. The man froze. I thought you were dead, he whispered. You made sure I was, the young man replied. The clock in the hall chimed. The sound bounced through the house long and sharp. Neither of them moved. The ticking of the clock filled the silence, louder now like each second was pressing down on the room. The man sat slowly on the edge of the couch, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment, he looked smaller, older, like the years had finally caught up with him. I had no choice, he said quietly, almost to himself. I did what I had to do. I had a business to protect, a reputation. Things were different then. The young man tilted his head slightly. You had a choice. You just chose yourself. The man looked up sharply, anger flashing in his eyes. You don't understand what it was like. Everyone was watching me. A disabled child. They would have called me weak. Investors would have pulled out. My wife, your wife, the boy cut in. The one who cried for days after you made her sign that paper? The one who begged you not to do it? The man's face went blank. How do you know that? She wrote it all down, the boy said softly, in a letter. She gave it to someone before she died. Told them to give it to me on my 18th birthday. The man's breath caught again. She's dead? Yes, the boy replied, and she died with your secret. For the first time, the man looked truly shaken. He rubbed his hands together, then stood and began pacing the room, his footsteps soft on the carpet but uneven. You think this is easy for me? He said, more to himself now. I built this life brick by brick. No one handed me anything. I made sacrifices. You didn't make a sacrifice, the boy said, his voice cold. You made a trade. You traded your own blood for silence. The man turned to face him, the fire in his voice rising again. You think I haven't suffered? You think I sleep at night? You think I don't remember that face every time I close my eyes? Then say it, the young man said, staring at him. Say what you did. The man opened his mouth, but no words came out. His pride, his power, everything he had built stood in the way. Can't do it? The boy asked. That's fine. You won't need to. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thin envelope. This is your handwriting, a signature, a transfer of custody, a payment to the hospital staff. I have all of it. The man didn't move. I'm not here to ruin you, the boy said, sliding the envelope onto the table. But your face is going to be on screens tonight, talking about how much you care about children like me. So maybe it's time someone heard the whole story. The man stared at the envelope like it might burn him, and for the first time in a long time, he had nothing to say. The room felt colder now, as if the weight of truth had pushed out the warmth. The man stood motionless, his eyes locked on the envelope. He didn't reach for it. He couldn't. His hands, the same ones that signed away his child, now hung useless at his sides. You planned this, he said finally, voice low and heavy. I planned to see you, the boy answered. I didn't plan what you'd feel. That part is yours. The man walked slowly to the table, but instead of picking up the envelope, he sank into the chair beside it. His fingers curled around the armrest like he was holding on to something that was slipping fast. What do you want from me? He asked, barely above a whisper. The boy looked at him. I told you. Nothing? Everyone wants something, the man muttered. Revenge. Money. A name. I already have a name, the boy said. One I earned, not one I inherited. Silence again. The man leaned back, staring up at the ceiling like it held answers. She told you everything, didn't she? She told me enough, the boy replied. She wasn't the same after it happened, the man said quietly. She didn't look at me the same. She never said it, but I knew. I killed something in her that day. You did more than that, the boy said. You left her with a ghost. She never got to hold me, never got to raise me. She watched from far away, scared to come near in case you found out. She lived with that pain until it ate her alive. The man closed his eyes. I thought, maybe if I never saw you again, it would go away. But I didn't go away, the boy said. I grew up. I struggled. I learned to live in a world that didn't want to make space for me. And every time someone stared at my chair or talked slower like I couldn't understand, I wondered if you were somewhere, pretending I didn't exist. The man opened his eyes slowly. And now? Now I don't wonder anymore, the boy said. Now I know exactly who you are. The man swallowed hard. Do you want to tell the world? I haven't decided yet, the boy said. But I know this. No matter what speech you give tonight, no matter how many cameras point at you, I'll still be the proof you tried to erase. The man reached for the envelope with a shaking hand but stopped halfway. It's all in there? He asked. Everything, the boy replied. Every lie you tried to bury. The man pulled his hand back. He couldn't touch it. He couldn't face it. Not yet. The quiet between them stretched long, thick with memories neither had lived together, but both had carried in their own ways. The air inside that mansion, once so still, now trembled with the pressure of truth. Outside, the soft hum of the fountain could barely be heard through the thick glass, but inside there was nothing but silence and shame. The man rose from the chair again, slower this time. His feet moved toward the fireplace across the room where a portrait hung, a painting of his second family, all dressed in bright colors, smiling, standing in the garden behind the house. The boy's eyes followed him but said nothing. Do they know? The man asked suddenly, still staring at the portrait. My wife, the children. Do they know about you? No, the boy replied. They know the version of you that only talks about success and legacy. The man gave a bitter laugh. Legacy? He said the word like it tasted rotten. That's what I was always chasing. That's why I did it. I told myself if I built something big enough, maybe it would erase what I did. Maybe it would make me clean. But legacy means nothing if it's built on silence, the boy said, his voice firmer now. You didn't erase anything. You only delayed the day it caught up to you. The man turned to face him again. His eyes looked older now, tired like the mask he wore had finally started to crack. I see you now and I wonder, who would you have been if I hadn't made that choice? If I'd kept you? The boy didn't answer right away. He watched the man carefully, trying to read whether it was guilt speaking or just fear of being exposed. Finally, he said, maybe I wouldn't have grown up in pain. Maybe I wouldn't have had to drag myself across the floor as a child because there was no money for a wheelchair. Maybe I wouldn't have had to watch the woman who raised me cry over bills while pretending she was fine. The man flinched. But maybe, the boy continued, I wouldn't have become the person I am now. And I'm proud of who I am. You didn't give me a life. You gave me something to survive. And I survived. The man looked down at the floor, eyes clouded. I thought you wouldn't make it. You thought wrong. There was a long pause. Then the man asked, why come now? Why not years ago? Why not wait longer? The boy adjusted the sleeve of his jacket slowly, his eyes locked on the man's. Because tonight you'll speak about disabled children. You'll tell people they matter. You'll look into cameras and ask for donations. You'll say all the right things. But the child you left behind, the one you were ashamed of, he's still breathing, still here, still watching. The man's face turned pale. This was never just about you, the boy said. It's about the people who believe in you, the ones who follow your words and don't know what you've done. They have the right to know who they're clapping for. The man's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. What do you want from me now? I told you, the boy said again. Nothing. I'm not here for revenge. I just wanted you to see me. Not in a file, not in a memory, not as a problem you erased, as a person, as your son. The man opened his mouth, but the word son caught in his throat. He couldn't say it back. Not yet. The boy's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He took it out, glanced at the screen, then looked back up. "I'll be watching tonight," he said quietly. "Let's see if you still say what you plan to." And with that, he turned the wheelchair toward the door, his hands firm on the wheels. The man didn't stop him. He only stood there, trapped in the walls of the empire he had built. And for the first time, he looked like a man who had just realized how much it had cost. The wheels moved slowly across the polished marble floor, quiet but certain. Each turn of the hand was steady, measured, as if the boy had already carried out what he came for. As he approached the door, the butler reappeared, startled to see him leaving so soon. He opened the door without a word, but his eyes lingered on the boy's face. There was something different about him now. Not anger, not sadness. Just something heavy, like someone who had seen too much for someone his age. Outside, the sky had turned darker. The evening wind pressed softly against his face as he reached the sidewalk. The mansion behind him stood tall, glowing with lights, but to him it was just another building now. He didn't look back. Down the road, a small car waited at the corner. A woman sat inside, the nurse who had raised him like her own. She stepped out as he approached, her face full of concern. "Did he see you?" she asked, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "He saw me," the boy said. "I don't know if he understood what he saw, but he saw me." She nodded and helped him into the car. They drove away slowly, passing the mansion one last time. He didn't turn his head. Inside the house, the man still stood in the same spot. The envelope sat untouched on the table, its contents louder than any voice. He ran a hand down his face, sat back down, and stared at the papers scattered around him. Financial reports, guest lists, talking points for the night's speech. Everything that once mattered now looked meaningless. He reached for a glass of water, but his hand trembled. After all these years, he had convinced himself that the child was gone, that the mistake was buried. But now that face, that calm, steady face, had broken through every lie he told himself. He had expected fury, screaming, demands. But the boy hadn't come to take anything. That was what shook him most. Upstairs, his second wife entered the bedroom, adjusting her earrings as she glanced in the mirror. She had no idea what had just happened downstairs. Their two younger children were playing in the hallway, laughing, unaware that the air inside their house had shifted forever. He watched them for a long moment, then looked at the mirror across the room. He barely recognized the man in the reflection. His tie was still neat, his shirt crisp, but his eyes had changed. The pride he had always worn had cracked. There was a tightness in his chest he couldn't ignore. He walked to the sink and splashed cold water on his face, hoping to calm himself. Later, a car came to pick him up for the gala. He sat in the back seat, holding a speech written by someone else, with words he had said 100 times before. But now they didn't sit right in his mouth. The car pulled up in front of the event hall. Glass walls, red carpet, bright lights. Photographers waited at the entrance, flashing cameras as he stepped out. He smiled out of habit, posed where he was told, nodded to the guests who greeted him. But his mind wasn't with them. It was stuck in that sitting room, staring at a boy in a wheelchair who had every reason to hate him, but hadn't. He walked inside the hall, surrounded by praise, by admiration, by people who only saw the clean version of his life. But as he moved toward the stage, the applause around him began to sound far away. His hands felt cold. The lights above felt too bright. The guilt followed him like a shadow, just behind the smile. Back at home, the boy sat with the nurse and her husband at the dinner table. They had made his favorite meal, hoping to bring him some comfort. But he ate quietly, picking at the food without really tasting it. "Are you okay?" the nurse asked. He looked up at her, his eyes softer now. "I think I'm tired. Not from today, just tired." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You did what many wouldn't have had the strength to do." "I didn't go to hurt him," the boy said. "I just wanted him to look at me and know that I was real." "And now he does," she said gently. He nodded, but somewhere deep inside he knew the night wasn't over yet. There was still something left, something waiting to unfold, something that would decide whether the truth would stay in that quiet sitting room or walk out into the world with him. The lights inside the event hall glowed with practiced warmth. Round tables were set with white linen, gold-edged plates, and tall glasses that caught the soft sparkle from the chandeliers above. Waiters moved silently between guests in black suits and shimmering gowns, carrying trays of food no one really ate. Everything was perfectly arranged, just as it always had been. Everything except the man at the center of it. He sat at the head table, surrounded by board members and donors who praised his leadership, laughed too loudly at his tired jokes, and leaned in a little too close when the cameras swung by. But his mind wasn't with them. Their words felt like static, their smiles like glass. The edges of the evening felt too sharp, too exposed. On the table before him sat a printed copy of his speech, folded neatly into thirds. He stared at it. The words felt foreign now. Phrases like inclusive future, equal opportunity, every child matters. He had said those things before, dozens of times, and no one had questioned him. But tonight, they tasted wrong. Bitter. His phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. He reached for it without thinking, but stopped when he saw the screen. Unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, then declined the call. A few seconds later, a message appeared. "I'm watching. I hope you say the truth." His hands stiffened around the phone. He didn't respond. He couldn't. He slid it back into his pocket and looked up at the stage. The announcer was calling his name. Applause rose around him as he stood, his legs moving on their own, trained by years of routine. He walked slowly to the stage, the spotlight already waiting. His smile appeared, thin and practiced, as he took the microphone. "Good evening," he began, the room falling silent. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight, for supporting this cause that is so close to my heart." The words flowed from his mouth like they always did. He praised the organization, told stories of children they had helped, spoke of progress and future goals. The audience nodded, clapped at the right moments, sipped wine between his pauses. But as he reached the final page of his speech, something shifted in his chest. He looked down at the last few lines, carefully crafted, optimistic, full of promises. And for a second, he saw something else. Not the page, not the crowd, but the boy, that face, calm, unshaken, holding truth like a blade. His fingers tightened around the podium. His heart thudded once, hard. He looked up again, this time without the smile. "There's something I wasn't planning to say tonight," he said. The room stilled. People looked at one another. The cameras rolled silently. "Years ago," he continued, "I made a choice that I've never spoken about, a choice that shaped everything I've done since. I had a son." There was a pause, confused glances rippled across the room. "He was born with a condition that would affect him for life. The doctors said it wouldn't be easy. And I didn't handle it with courage. I didn't handle it with love. I walked away." A gasp escaped from somewhere in the audience. "I told myself it was the right thing, that I was protecting my future, that I was protecting my name. But the truth is, I was protecting my fear. And that fear turned into silence. And that silence became a lie I lived with for 18 years. His voice cracked for the first time. "I saw my son today," he said. "He is alive. He is strong. He is everything I wasn't." Another silence fell, heavier now. No one moved, and no one touched their glass. "I don't know if this confession means anything to him, but to all of you who have stood beside me, who trusted me, this is the truth. This is who I am, and no amount of success, no foundation, no speech will ever erase what I did." He stepped back from the mic. There was no applause, only the quiet breath of a room stunned into stillness. Far away in a small apartment, the boy sat in front of a screen. The broadcast played silently. He had muted the sound before it started. He didn't need to hear the words. He just needed to see the man's face. When the confession came, he didn't blink. He watched the man speak into the mic, watched the truth come out, not cleanly, not proudly, but like something forced out from under too many years of weight. The nurse came into the room and sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "He said it," she whispered. "He said the truth." The boy nodded once. He did, but inside something twisted. It didn't feel like justice yet. Not fully. Because the truth may have come out on a stage, but the damage it left behind had lived in silence for nearly 2 decades. And now the whole world would finally hear the sound of it breaking. The days that followed were nothing like the man had expected. The confession, once it left his mouth, had spread faster than he could imagine. News clips replayed his speech across channels. Social media feeds filled with headlines. Business tycoon admits abandoning disabled son. Charity leader confesses past mistake at Lave Gala. Some called him brave. Others called him a coward who only spoke up when he had no other choice. But none of their voices mattered more than the one he hadn't heard since that night. His office was quiet now. Most of the staff walked past his glass walls without looking in. Some had already stopped showing up, unsure of how long the company would last under the weight of scandal. Board meetings were being scheduled without his presence. Emails from sponsors remained unread. His publicist had stopped answering his calls. The only sound in the room was the slow ticking of the clock above his head, counting the seconds of his downfall. He sat behind his desk, the same desk he had once used to sign contracts worth millions. Now the only thing on it was the envelope the boy had left behind. He hadn't opened it yet. He didn't need to. He already knew what was inside. Proof, paperwork, memories frozen in ink. But what haunted him more than the contents of that envelope was the look on the boy's face. Not anger, not pain, just disappointment. The kind that stays with you because it's too calm, too honest. He thought of calling him, reaching out, saying something. But what would he say? That he was sorry? That he regretted everything? That he wished he had chosen differently? The boy had already made it clear he hadn't come for words. Somewhere across the city, the boy sat in a small cafe, a warm drink between his hands. He wasn't reading the articles or watching the clips. He didn't need to. The world was reacting now, but for him, the reaction wasn't the goal. The moment had already passed. The truth had been spoken. The silence had been broken. But there was still something unfinished inside him. The nurse joined him a few minutes later, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked at him for a moment before speaking. "He's fallen hard," she said softly. "I know," the boy replied. "People are saying this could ruin him. I'm not sure if that matters to me anymore." She paused, then asked, "Then what does?" The boy looked out the window, watching the cars pass, the people move along the sidewalk, unaware of the storm that had just passed through someone's life. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I never did. But I do want him to live with what he did. I want him to sit in that house, in that office, and remember what it cost. Not just to him, but to me, to her." The nurse nodded, her eyes soft. "You carry her in everything you say. She'd be proud of you." "I wish she could have seen it," he whispered. "Not the fall, the truth, that I made it, that I'm okay." He looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "She spent her life hoping he'd change," he said. "She waited for a call that never came, a letter that never arrived. She never stopped loving him, even after what he did. That was her weakness. I can't be like that." "She didn't stay weak," the nurse said gently. "She stayed kind. There's a difference." The boy's throat tightened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The warmth of the cafe, the quiet hum of conversation around them, it all felt distant. Back in the mansion, the man finally reached for the envelope. His fingers hesitated on the seal, but he forced them to move. The paper inside was cold, unforgiving. Hospital documents, witness statements, old letters, all in his name, all stamped with the truth he had spent years denying. He sat there reading each page, one by one, feeling something inside him begin to crack. Not loudly but slowly, like the sound of wood breaking beneath too much pressure. At the bottom of the last page was a handwritten note. Short, simple, no threats, no demands. "I forgave you the moment I saw your face, but that doesn't mean I'll ever forget." There was no name at the bottom, but the handwriting, it looked like hers. The same curve in the letters, the same softness. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and for the first time in 18 years, he allowed himself to cry. Not for the scandal, not for the loss of power, but for the life he could have had, the boy he could have held, the woman he could have kept. And none of it could be undone. Rain tapped gently against the wide windows of the mansion, drawing pale streaks down the glass. Inside the office, the man remained in his chair, motionless. The documents spread out before him like pieces of a past he could no longer escape. He hadn't moved in hours. His phone had rung a few times. Calls from board members, messages from reporters, a voicemail from his wife asking when he'd be coming home. He ignored them all. His eyes were fixed on the note. He had read it at least 20 times, but the words refused to lose their weight. I forgave you the moment I saw your face, but that doesn't mean I'll ever forget. He didn't know what hurt more, the forgiveness he didn't deserve, or the certainty that the boy would carry the scar forever. He stood up slowly, his joints stiff, and walked over to the bookshelf where old photographs sat hidden among the rows of books. There was one in particular, a photo he hadn't looked at in years. He reached behind a frame and pulled it out. It was faded now, but he still remembered the moment. She had been standing in the garden, one hand resting on her stomach, the other shielding her eyes from the sun. She was smiling. It was taken just weeks before everything changed. He had told himself for years that he did what any powerful man would have done, that he had protected what he built. But standing here now, with the photo in one hand and his son's truth lying on the desk behind him, he realized that all those reasons had been excuses, and excuses couldn't fill the silence of a nursery that never heard a child cry. They couldn't erase the sound of his wife's voice breaking when she pleaded with him not to go through with it, and they definitely couldn't undo 18 years of absence. Downstairs, the house was quiet. His younger children were at school. His wife had taken the driver and gone out hours ago. He was alone, just as he had been the day he signed that paper and erased his firstborn from his life. Except now, the silence was different. Now it was filled with memory. The next morning, the news channels moved on. Another scandal had surfaced. Someone else's failure had taken the spotlight. The world moved quickly, but inside his house, time moved slower than ever. Across the city, the boy sat in the small study of the nurse's home. His wheelchair faced the window, where he could see the rooftops lined in gray under the cloudy sky. A notebook lay open on the desk beside him, blank except for a name scribbled once at the top. The name of a man he had never been allowed to say out loud until now. He had spent the last few days trying to feel something final. Closure, relief, maybe even justice. But it hadn't come, not like he thought it would. The world now knew the truth, but the truth didn't change the years he had missed. The birthdays, the hospital stays, the school plays where he sat in the front row, waiting to see just one face in the crowd that never showed up. The nurse entered quietly, carrying a small tray with tea and toast. She placed it on the table beside him and rested a hand on his shoulder. "You haven't eaten," she said gently. "I'm not hungry." She sat down beside him. "He stepped down from the board this morning," she said. "It's official." He didn't respond. He hasn't spoken to the press since the gala, but someone close to him gave a statement, said he's not doing well, that he's refusing to leave the house. Still, he said nothing. She watched him carefully. "You don't need to carry him anymore. You already did more than most people ever would." "I thought it would feel different," he said quietly. "I thought once the world knew, something inside me would, I don't know, finally settle." She nodded. "Sometimes the world's reaction isn't what brings peace. Sometimes it's the small things, the people you love, the ones who stayed." He looked at her, the woman who had stayed when his own father had turned his back, the woman who taught him how to move his arms when the doctor said he wouldn't, the one who never looked at him with pity. "You gave me everything he didn't," he said softly. "You gave me purpose," she whispered. "You saved me just as much as I saved you." The boy turned back to the window. "Do you think he ever truly cared?" The nurse didn't answer right away. Then with careful words she said, "I think he was too afraid to find out what caring would cost him. And by the time he realized it, it was too late." The rain outside picked up, streaking faster down the glass. But inside the room something else settled. Not peace, not yet, but maybe the first steps toward it. The boy reached for the notebook again. This time he didn't stop after writing the name. He started writing the truth. His truth. Not the one that appeared in newspapers or sat in legal documents. The one that had lived in his body for 18 years. The one he had carried through every step, every struggle, every silence. Because the world might move on. But he wasn't ready to forget. Not yet. Days passed, but the silence inside the mansion remained unchanged. Curtains stayed drawn. Phones stayed unanswered. Even the household staff moved quieter, their footsteps softer, conversations held in whispers. They avoided the study now. The heavy door stayed shut most hours of the day, and when it opened, it was only for food to be placed inside and taken away untouched. He spent most of his time sitting in the dark, the papers still on the desk, the envelope still half open. He had read everything already, but he left it there, as if to punish himself. The confession had taken something out of him, something permanent. And though the world had heard the truth, he couldn't bring himself to face the one person whose forgiveness might have mattered most. His second wife had returned home days ago, but her presence had changed. She moved through the house like a stranger now. She hadn't asked questions. She had read the headlines just like everyone else. She hadn't said a word about it, but her silence wasn't empty. It was full of disappointment. She slept in the guest room now. At dinner, their youngest son had asked, "Dad, what's a scandal?" The man hadn't answered. He had just sat there, his spoon frozen above the bowl, unable to lie to another child. That night, as the lights of the city blinked outside his window, he stood in front of the old mirror. In his study, he looked at his own reflection, the lines in his face deeper, the skin under his eyes darker. He looked like a man who had finally run out of time. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over a name that had no photo attached. Just a number. A name that hadn't been there until a few days ago, added after a message came from a private source. The same person who had delivered the envelope and the note. "You'll want to save this," the message had said. "It's your son's number." He stared at it now, unsure if calling would make anything better, or worse. Then he pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. He set it down and leaned back in the chair. He didn't leave a voicemail. What could he even say? He had already used up the only truth he had. Across the city, the boy saw the missed call flash across his phone screen. He didn't pick it up. He sat still for a long moment, the phone resting on the table beside him, vibrating once before it went quiet again. The nurse sitting nearby didn't say a word. She just watched him. "He's trying," she said eventually. "I know," the boy replied. "Do you want to speak to him?" "No," he said. "Not yet." "Because you're not ready, or because he doesn't deserve it?" The boy turned to her, his face unreadable. "Both." She nodded slowly. "That's fair." He stood up then, pushing the wheelchair forward, his movements smooth and practiced. He moved through the hallway of their home, pausing near the shelf filled with photo frames. Most were small, faded with time. Him as a baby, her holding him during therapy sessions, their modest birthday celebrations. But one frame sat empty. The nurse noticed. "I never filled that one," she said. "I thought maybe one day we'd have a picture of all 3 of us." "There was never an all 3 of us," he said quietly. She didn't argue, but he picked up the frame anyway and stared at the empty space. At the mansion, the man remained in the study well past midnight. His thoughts circled back to her again. The first woman, the one who had carried his child, pleaded with him not to give up on their son. The one he had silenced with power and distance. Her face haunted him more now than ever. Not in the way ghosts haunt, but in the way regret lives. Silent and suffocating. He walked to the drawer where he had kept one of her old scarves. She had left it the night she packed her things, and he had hidden it, never admitting to himself why he kept it. It smelled of lavender, long faded but still present. He held it in his hands like something too fragile to own. For the first time in his life, he whispered her name. And then, he said their sons, not as a thought, but out loud. His voice cracked under the weight of both. Far away in the quiet of the night, the boy sat at his desk again. The notebook now had pages filled with his handwriting. Memories, moments, bits of pain, yes, but also the beginnings of understanding. He picked up a pen and paused. Then he wrote one sentence he hadn't been able to write before. He saw me. Not he apologized. Not he came back. Just that. He saw me. And for now, that was enough. The morning sun rose quietly, slipping between the curtains of both homes like a silent observer. In the mansion, the man stood by his window, arms crossed, eyes distant. He hadn't slept. The night had drained him, not just of energy, but of the illusion he had lived with for years. The idea that life would never hold him accountable. Now that the truth had cracked through the surface, everything else felt exposed. His achievements, his title, his fortune, they all felt smaller now, like they had been built on sand, not stone. He had always believed control was his greatest strength, control over his image, his decisions, his silence. But control had kept him from his son. Control had buried the truth. And now, standing here in the dim light, he realized how much it had cost him. Downstairs, the butler entered the room with caution, carrying the morning paper on a silver tray. He placed it on the table, but before he could leave, the man spoke. "Tell them to cancel all my meetings this week." The butler nodded, but didn't leave right away. "Sir, there's a letter. Arrived early this morning. No name. Just left at the gate." The man turned slowly. "Where is it?" The butler stepped forward and handed over a plain white envelope. The handwriting on the front was careful, familiar. The man's breath caught before he opened it. Inside was a single page. "You said the truth, but you didn't say my name. You told them what you did, but you didn't tell them who I am. That silence still belongs to me. When you're ready to face me, not just your shame, let me know." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. The man folded the letter with trembling hands and sat down slowly. For the first time in days, something clear pushed through the fog of guilt. This wasn't over. Not yet. Meanwhile, across the city, the boy sat in the quiet of the public library, a place he had often gone as a child when the apartment felt too small, too crowded with thoughts. The same corner table he always liked, next to the window. The same wooden chair that creaked when he shifted his weight. The same librarian who nodded at him without asking questions. In front of him were two folders, one labeled legal options, the other labeled media requests. He stared at both. His face was calm, but inside he felt torn. A part of him wanted to walk away, let the truth do what it would. The other part wanted something more direct, something that made his name heard, not just whispered behind a scandal. The nurse had joined him again, sitting across the table with a thermos of tea she poured slowly into a paper cup. "You don't have to decide today," she said. "I know. Sometimes silence can be power too." "Not always," he replied. "He kept silent and erased me. If I stay silent now, I stay erased." She nodded. "So what would saying your name change?" He looked at her, steady and clear. "It would make me real, not just to him, but to the world that clapped for him." She took a sip of tea. "Then say it. Say it so loud no one can pretend not to hear." He looked down at the folders again. The legal one would give him a case. Proof, records, testimony. It would open wounds in court. Maybe it would bring justice. But at what cost? The media folder was different. Requests from reporters, TV shows, podcasts, all wanting to interview the boy behind the confession. None of them knew his face yet, but they would. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small photograph. It was the only baby picture he had. He had found it years ago, hidden in the back of a medical file the nurse had forgotten she even had. A nurse had snapped it during his first week in the hospital, when he was still wrapped in bandages and hooked to wires. In the corner, faint and almost gone, was a single name written in blue ink. Amal. He looked at the picture for a long time. Then he picked up a pen and wrote his name across the top of the first page in the media folder. Amal. No initials. No fake last name. Just his truth. Back at the mansion, the man sat alone with the letter. He read it again and again, each word heavier than the last. He whispered the name once. Amal. It broke something inside him, because it was the first time he had said it out loud. He had given that child life, but he had never given him a name. Now, 18 years later, the name finally echoed in the silence he had built around himself. And it didn't leave. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. not empty, but still, as if the city itself had paused for a breath before moving again. Amal's name hadn't yet reached the public. Not fully, but things were shifting. Quiet calls began coming in from journalists who claimed they would treat his story with care. Messages from foundations asking to collaborate, not just for publicity, but to hear his experience. Some, of course, were there for attention, looking to profit from his pain. But Amal could tell the difference. He had learned how to read people the hard way. He took his time. He didn't rush to respond. Each request he received was placed into one of three piles: no, maybe, and not yet. He hadn't found a single yes yet. Instead, he spent more time writing. Not just the story of his father, but the story of his life. He wrote about the small apartment where his wheelchair barely fit through the hallway. He wrote about the first time he fell out of his chair in public and no one stopped to help. He wrote about the nurse, Zinat, who spent years treating him like he wasn't broken, even when the world did. He wrote about the quiet victories, the ones no camera had ever captured. In the evenings, Zinat would cook. Her husband, Iqbal, would set the table with old placemats that had faded over the years. They didn't ask Amal for updates unless he offered them. They simply made space for his thoughts, his silence, his processing. The kind of space no one else had ever offered him. But even in that calm, Amal felt something waiting. The letter he'd left at the mansion had stirred something. He hadn't expected a reply, but on the fifth day after sending it, a knock came at their apartment door. Iqbal opened it first, cautious by habit. Outside stood a man in a long coat, hands clasped, eyes tired. Amal didn't need to ask who it was. He rolled his chair forward until he came into view. The man standing outside didn't speak. He looked thinner, paler, not sick, but worn down by something inside. Zinat stepped forward. "He came alone." "I know," Amal said. He nodded to Iqbal, who stepped aside, though not far. Zinat stayed close too, folding her arms, her gaze sharp. The man stood in the doorway like someone who had forgotten how to enter a place with humility. But finally he spoke. "I got your letter," he said. Amal didn't answer. The man continued. "You were right. I said the truth, but I didn't say your name. I wasn't ready." "And now?" Amal asked. The man swallowed hard. "I don't know if I'm ready now either, but I'm here." The silence stretched between them, not angry, not peaceful, just real. "I didn't know it back then," the man said, "but the day I signed that paper, I didn't erase you, I erased myself." Amal's face didn't shift. "You didn't just erase yourself. You erased my mother, her name, her story. You erased what she carried, and you did it without flinching." The man looked down. "I flinched," he whispered. "I just flinched in private." "You had the power to stand beside her," Amal said. "You chose to stand on top of her instead." The man's throat tightened. "I think about her every day." "It's not her memory that matters now," Amal said. "It's what you're willing to do with what's left." The man looked up. "Tell me what to do." "No," Amal replied. "You don't get instructions. You had your chances. I'm not here to fix you. I'm here to remind you that you don't get to walk away again." Zinat stepped forward then, voice firm. "This is not your house. Don't come here looking for healing without scars." He didn't get that option. "Neither will you." The man nodded slowly. "I understand." "I doubt that," Zinat said. Amal didn't speak again. He just looked at the man, the father who had let go before the first word, the first step, the first anything. The man stepped back from the door. "I won't come again unless you ask. But I'll be waiting." "For what?" Amal asked. "For a second chance." Amal's eyes didn't soften. "Second chances are for people who made mistakes. You made a decision." The man gave a small nod. Not defensive, not begging, just defeated. Then he turned and walked down the narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing all the way down the stairwell until they faded out of hearing. Zinat closed the door gently. Iqbal sighed from the kitchen. He looked like a man who's already lost everything. Amal didn't reply. He rolled back into the living room, where the stack of letters and folders still waited on the table. But now one new thing sat next to them, a note Zinat had placed there earlier. It said only 5 words. Truth is only the beginning. Amal stared at it for a long time, because he knew she was right. The world had heard the truth, but his story had only just begun. The apartment was quiet again, but now the quiet felt different. Not the emptiness of waiting, but the stillness that comes after someone walks in and leaves a part of themselves behind. Amal sat at the window watching the city shift under the fading afternoon sun. The man, his father, had left, but not without leaving something behind. Not an apology, not understanding, just presence. For 18 years, that's what had been missing. Now it stood like a question mark at the edge of Amal's mind. Zenat came in carrying folded laundry, placed it neatly on the nearby shelf, and gave him a glance. "You said everything you needed to?" He nodded once, then paused. "But it still doesn't feel over." "Because it isn't," she said. "He's not the only one who needs to face something." Amal looked at her, unsure what she meant. She continued, "You've been writing his story, his mistakes, his choices, his silence, but what about yours?" "I didn't choose any of this," he said quickly, almost defensively. "I know," she said gently, "but you chose how to survive it, and now you're choosing how to live past it." Her words hung in the air. Amal turned his wheelchair and moved slowly toward the desk. The folders were still there, but so was the notebook, the one that had started with bitterness and turned slowly into something more honest, something heavier. He opened it, flipping through the filled pages. His childhood, the therapy, the hospital visits, the days Zenat worked double shifts just to pay for equipment, the moments he thought he wouldn't make it, until he did. He reached the final page, blank. He stared at it for a long time. Then slowly he wrote, "I don't need his name to become someone. I don't need his guilt to feel whole. I am not what he gave up. I am what came after. I am what survived. I am what grew." When he stopped writing, something loosened in his chest. Not closure, just air. Enough to breathe a little easier. That evening, Amal received a message from a small independent journalist. Not a major media house. No lights, no agenda. Just a young woman who had been following the story and had written, "I won't ask you to perform your pain. I just want to hear your voice, if and when you're ready." It was the first yes he felt sure of. He replied simply, "Let's talk." 2 days later, they met in a quiet community center, not far from the hospital where he'd been born. The walls were painted light blue. The chairs were mismatched. There were no cameras, just a microphone and a recorder placed gently on the table between them. The journalist asked simple questions. What was it like growing up? What did silence feel like? What does it mean to forgive someone who never asked to be forgiven? Amal answered all of them, not as a victim, not as a headline, just as himself. He didn't speak in anger, he didn't cry, but when he talked about Zenat and Iqbal, his voice softened. And when he talked about his mother, there was a quiet pause, one he didn't fill with words. Because some things live in silence. When the interview ended, the journalist asked, "Do you want me to mention his name?" Amal shook his head. "Number, this story isn't about him anymore. It's about me." The interview was published as an audio piece. No clickbait title, no sensational edit, just one sentence across the top. Amal, the name he hid, the voice he couldn't silence. The reaction was unexpected. Thousands of people shared it, not because of scandal, but because of something deeper. They heard strength in his calm, power in his restraint. People with similar stories wrote to him. Strangers who had been abandoned, forgotten, or cast aside. One message stood out. "I used to think I was invisible, but you made me feel seen. Thank you for speaking when I couldn't." Amal read it 3 times, and then, quietly, he replied, "You were never invisible. You just needed someone to remind you." Back in the mansion, the man listened to the interview in his study, alone. His name was never spoken, but he recognized every silence, every truth, every space where something he never gave had to be found somewhere else. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just listened until the last word faded. And in that moment, he knew the world no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the son who had learned to live without him. and who had finally, truly stepped into his own name. Weeks passed. Amal's story continued to ripple outward, not as a scandal, not as gossip, but as something more human, more lasting. People who had never spoken about their own pain began writing letters to him. Some were parents, admitting regrets. Some were sons and daughters, still waiting for apologies that might never come. Others were caretakers like Zenat, who had stepped in where others had stepped out. They wrote to him not to praise, but to connect, to say, "I know what that feels like." Amal read every letter. He didn't respond to all of them, but he carried their weight with care. Each one reminded him that his story wasn't just his anymore. It had become a mirror for those who had stayed silent too long. He started a small blog, not to relive his story, but to open space for others. He called it Left But Living. The name meant something now. It wasn't about being abandoned. It was about continuing anyway, about creating after loss, speaking after silence, healing without permission. People began to write their own names there, sometimes just one line, sometimes a full story. Amal didn't judge the length. He knew some names carried more weight than full paragraphs. One night after updating the blog, he sat by the window, Zenat beside him, quietly folding laundry as she always did. The soft sounds of the evening filled the apartment. Traffic from the road, the creak of the old ceiling fan, the gentle shuffle of Iqbal in the kitchen, humming a song only he remembered the words to. "I didn't think it would reach this far," Amal said quietly. Zenat smiled. "Truth doesn't stop where we think it will. It walks through walls we didn't know existed." He looked over at her. "Do you ever wish we could have changed the beginning?" She paused, folding a small shirt. "Number, I only wish it had hurt you less." "I think," he said, "the pain is what taught me how to see clearly." She nodded. "But now that you've seen, you have to decide what to do with what's next." He knew she was right, because while the world had responded to his voice, the man who gave him life still hadn't disappeared. Amal hadn't seen him since that quiet conversation at the door, but a part of him wondered, what had that visit truly meant? Was it a real step forward, or just another failed attempt at redemption? That question was answered the following week. A letter arrived, not emailed, not typed, handwritten, folded with care, delivered by courier, addressed simply to Amal. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was slightly uneven, like it hadn't been used in a while. "I listened to your interview twice. I heard things I never deserved to hear, things you should have never had to say. There's no excuse I can offer, no version of me that makes any of it better, but I heard your silence. I heard your calm, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to run from the truth. I wanted to sit with it. I wanted to face the version of myself I had buried. You asked me not to come unless I was ready to see you, not just my shame. I don't know if I ever will be fully ready, but I'm willing to try. If you ever choose to meet me again, this time it will be your name on the door, your terms, your pace. I won't ask you for anything. I only want to offer what I never gave: time, space, and honesty. Your father, Yusuf." Amal read the letter twice, then folded it neatly. He didn't cry. He didn't tremble. But something inside him shifted, not because of the apology, but because the man had used his own name. Yusuf. It was the first time he had ever seen it signed. The name was no longer a shadow that haunted newspaper articles or corporate documents. It was human now. Not fixed, not forgiven, but human. That night, Amal didn't talk about the letter. He didn't show it to Zenat. He simply sat outside on the small balcony, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the lights that stretched across the city. Lights he had once watched and wondered about. Lights behind windows where other families sat, ate, lived. He had always wondered what it would have been like to grow up behind one of those windows. Now he knew he hadn't missed as much as he thought, because family wasn't just blood. It wasn't about who gave you life. It was about who stayed when you needed it most. And while Yusuf had stepped forward too late, Amal still had something stronger. Zenat's patience, Iqbal's quiet strength, his own voice, and now perhaps a new question that he finally had the power to answer. Not as a child looking for a father, but as a man choosing what kind of future to build. One step at a time. Spring came slowly, brushing the city in pale gold and softer winds. The trees bloomed again, the streets buzzed with life, and with the change of season came the quiet unfolding of something new. Not loud, not grand, but deeply personal. Amal sat beneath a tree in the city park, the same one where Zinat used to bring him when he was little, wrapped in thick blankets, too young to understand why people stared. He remembered watching children run, the way their laughter echoed freely. He used to wonder what it felt like to move without limits. But over time, he learned that real strength wasn't in running fast. It was in standing firm when you had every reason to fall apart. That morning he had received another letter. This time it wasn't from Yusuf. It was from a stranger, a young man from a different city who had listened to Amal's interview and read every blog post. He wrote of a father who had walked out, of a mother who had died in silence, of nights spent wishing he could vanish just to see if anyone would notice. He ended the letter with, "You gave me the words I didn't have. You made me believe I can still become someone." Amal folded the letter slowly, placed it into the small notebook he carried everywhere now. The same one that had once held anger and sorrow, now filled with stories of courage, of grief turned into purpose. The blog had grown beyond what he'd imagined. Left, but living was no longer just his space. It had become a movement, a place where people, once afraid to name their pain, found comfort in someone else's honesty. Survivors of abandonment, people with disabilities, caretakers and children raised by strangers, they all found something in Amal's story that reminded them of their own worth. He no longer needed to explain who he was. He no longer needed Yusuf's name or the world's permission to feel whole. The world had come to know him on his terms, and that was something no one could take back. Back in the mansion, Yusuf moved through the house with less noise now, less importance. The hallway echoes had changed. His wife had taken the children to visit her sister abroad. He didn't stop her. He knew trust had to be rebuilt with time and truth, and both were things he had denied for too long. He no longer held a position at the foundation. No more boardrooms, no more spotlights. But he still volunteered quietly, answering calls, helping behind the scenes, never stepping forward. And when people recognized him, he didn't explain. He just nodded and returned to the work. One afternoon, he walked into a bookstore near the edge of the city. There, on a display table by the window, was a slim book titled Left But Living, Stories That Remain, a published collection of posts and reflections from Amal's blog. He picked up a copy. On the back was a single sentence from Amal himself. "Being left is not the end of the story. Sometimes it's the start of the one you write yourself." Yusuf bought the book and didn't ask for a bag. He walked out slowly, holding it with both hands. Amal never called him back, but he didn't need to, because this wasn't about Yusuf anymore. It was about Amal. The man who had once been erased from existence now had a voice louder than any legacy money could build. Amal's next step wasn't another article or interview. It was something quieter, something more permanent. He and Zinat founded a small community center for children with physical disabilities and children raised outside their biological families. A place with ramps instead of stairs, walls painted with names instead of quotes, and doorways wide enough to welcome stories that the world often tried to leave out. On the opening day, a small crowd gathered. No press, no ceremony, just families, children, caretakers, and laughter that didn't ask for permission to be loud. Amal rolled into the center wearing a white kurta, his hair brushed back, his smile calm and unshaken. Beside him, Zinat stood with her hand gently resting on his shoulder. Iqbal brought out tea in paper cups, grumbling about the weather as usual, and for once, everything felt whole. Inside, on a clean white wall near the entrance, a plaque had been placed. It read, "In memory of those who stayed, in honor of those who survived." Amal. He didn't need to say more, because sometimes survival isn't loud. It's quiet. It's steady. It's a boy who was once left behind, growing into a man who chose not to look back with bitterness, but to build something no one could ever erase. And in that, he didn't just find peace. He became it. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one.